Hello, and welcome to the Autistic Me podcast. I'm Christopher Scott Wyatt, and today I'm being joined once again by Daniel Sansing, who is a university instructor and a writing tutor. During graduate school, Daniel noticed that he thinks in theory, which I find fascinating as a college instructor, because one of the challenges we have is to guide students and ourselves towards theory instead of or beyond the practical applied knowledge. So, Daniel, could you explain how you view your thought process as being different in some ways than our colleagues?
Well, I noticed fairly early on in graduate school, and this was the case throughout graduate school, that I like theory. I guess I'm a theory nerd. When some of the students were struggling in a particular class with social constructivism, I just take to it like a duck in water. I like to think that I do have some pragmatic sides to me and that I can translate this into stuff that I can do in the classroom, but I've always been very at home in theory, and there's not really anything that, like, it doesn't matter if it's physics or geology or really what the field is. And I like transdisciplinarity, cross field sort of, maybe even above fields in a way, thinking like dynamic systems theory. I like to apply to language acquisition. And I've liked the way that that's been done by some other scholars like Diane Larson Freeman. So that I'm kind of at home in theory, and that's kind of my playground. And I get a little frustrated sometimes with people who don't do theory as well, and they want to focus on the minutia. That's not always my wheelhouse.
A myth about autistics is that we are only pragmatic and only practical, and that we avoid the theoretical. And yet I find myself deeply fascinated by studies of rhetoric, philosophy, psychology, the social sciences. And yet people expect me to focus entirely on the concrete, when I think that's a myth that we need to expose in the autism community.
The psychologist who diagnosed me thought that it was odd that I was in the humanities instead of in a science or math or something like that. And I like those. My mom was a high school science teacher, but she was also a double major in English. So I grew up with books. I grew up reading Scientific American or Science or, those kinds of periodicals, as well as being able to read literature and poetry and all those kind of things. Like, I got a very broad background. I think that's been beneficial to me. But maybe I actually started college. I was in the pre-med dorm, which was kind of cool. I started with an interest in neurology, and then I switched to anthropology, and finally I wound up in English because I liked to read and I liked to write. So that's why I wound up here. But I think I could have done any number of careers, including being a physician and a neurologist.
Many of the autistic individuals with whom I've spoken studied something that wasn't their natural strength. For example, I certainly can and do enjoy computer programming. And what fascinated me about language was the fact that it is imprecise and that it would be more of a challenge to study, as where I found myself bored and disengaged from the computer classes. Did you find yourself attracted to the challenge of theory?
That's part of it. I was on the computer programming team in high school, and I liked math. I didn't compete in any math events or anything like that, but until you get into the really higher levels of theoretical math, it all seems kind of like if there's only one answer, I don't know that I like it as well. I like it when there are lots of different answers and that you argue for whichever one you feel the most affinity to. So I'm not really an only one answer kind of person, I guess, and I really never have been, going all the way back. I tested really well on standardized tests in all different fields, but I like the theoretical. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it's just the way that I read.
Do you find that the assumption that we are supposed to be in the math and science fields, you mentioned that even your evaluator was guilty of this mythology of autism and math and science. Do you feel that traps some students entering our higher education environment where they are expected to be something and autistics aren't one thing?
Yeah, I feel like there are a lot of people going into IT that wouldn't necessarily go into IT, and I talk to students all the time. I'm not an advisor, but in my capacity in the writing center, I'm also a student success tutor, and sometimes we'll just talk about is this what you really love to do? I mean, do you really feel an affinity for this? What is it that you like? And a lot of times, I mean, like all students, neurotypicals included, they're kind of moved into a field by their parents or by their friends, or they heard they could make some money in this field, and it's not really they're not doing the Joseph Campbell thing and following their bliss. They're really just doing it for a job, which I think doing it for a job is only going to get you so far. You've got to have another motivation. I think that we're maximized as human beings when we really love what we do.
Why is it that people are surprised when you say you are in writing and writing studies?
I think there's this idea that sort of the social side of that is something that I'll struggle with. And honestly, the poetry that I wrote in as an undergrad, I did finally get some things published, but for a long time, people just hated my stuff. I mean, they absolutely hated my poetry. Now, a lot of it is truly terribly bad and should be burned and buried somewhere. But I had one advocate on the group of students that did the reviews for our publication at one institution where I was, and he lobbied for one of my poems. But for the most part, like what I wrote in creative writing classes, the other students really just hated it. I used a lot of illusion. I used a lot of stuff that would really be footnoted. Like if you read T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, you see all the footnotes. That's the kind of stuff I wrote. And if you didn't have the intertextuality to read that, then you were probably going to be pissed off at me. And I think they were pissed off because I did it that way. So, I couldn't write the nice, neat, sort of crafty kind of language that they did. Mine was messy and brutal and honest and a lot of, a lot of illusion, intertextuality.
My wife has said that I tend to write with two problems. One is that I assume the audience is well read on the topic, and the other is that I somewhat reject the academic stilted language, not necessarily a rejection of large and complicated words or thoughts, but of the words I consider academies. How do you believe that your writing may or may not reflect that depth of knowledge that you brought into subjects?
I'm not sure that I still experience my own language in the way that other people do. So I think it's kind of hard for me to explain what I do exactly. Although on the book chapter that hopefully comes out this year, the second reviewer said that it was terrific, and they hope that I expanded it into a book. They said it's the only chapter in the book that they felt like should be expanded into its own book, which was really flattering, I thought. And they called me a strong writer and researcher, which also was very flattering. And usually I hear that second reviewer is mean, so I don't know. I don't know why it went that way. But I think I developed a lot more audience awareness when I was a newspaper reporter. And I simplified my language a lot when I was a newspaper reporter. So I think that has made it easier to negotiate the academic ivory tower stuff with the everyday, we're supposed to write on this quote unquote fourth grade level for the newspaper, which is just ridiculous. I was writing about murder trials and DNA evidence. So I wasn't going to be writing on a fourth grade level. But I think that training, working for the newspaper, was a good way to help me to connect better with any audience.
There are a number of autistic scholars within rhetoric and writing studies now, and many of us are advocating for changes to writing pedagogy, embracing more diversity of style, for example, the use of I. How do you think that having more autistic scholars will improve or at least open up the variety of approaches that autistic students can then bring into our classrooms?
Well, I hate to generalize about autistic students and autistic writers because I see a lot of diversity. It's the same generalization that we make about a lot of other groups. We do the same thing with autism, and in fact, Yes, there are a lot of students who tend to be pretty formal and pretty formulaic sometimes in their writing, and they kind of want a mold or a pattern or something to pour their writing into. But at the same time, there can be extremely creative students who are coming at it from a very different angle. So I think largely as instructors and tutors, we have to be open to the difference that we'll see and help whoever the student is negotiate their ideas and their language into a product that's going to be accepted by their professors. I mean, we bang our heads against the ivory tower every day. Hopefully, we can help the students have a little less frustration in that process.
Did you experience challenges translating your thought process into academic success?
Wow, I was always a good student for the most part. I think that I sometimes confused my audience, including professors, but I think they saw something there that they thought had potential, or that they thought, maybe down the road was going to be that could turn into something special. But I struggled as an undergrad. I had like a 3.27. I had, of course, I was going through a lot of depression, and hadn't been diagnosed with CVID, which I also think was causing me a lot of depression. Hadn't had surgery for sleep apnea, which was probably also causing depression. But I completed a master's degree between 2013 and 2016 with a 4.0, which I never thought would happen. So I think I'm pretty good at studenting now. But it's been an ongoing process because my stuff at first was odd, bizarre, queer, whatever word you want to use. It was different. But I think my professors could see at least a potential or some kind of brilliance to it.
When you have described your interest in theory, you have said that you are attracted to the abstract and attracted to the broader picture. How does that reflect in your teaching strategies?
I think that one of my talents is seeing differently. I see teaching differently. I see writing differently. I see my students differently. And if I have a weakness, it's probably that I'm more prone to see my students for what they can be or could be in the future rather than where they are at the present moment. But I think that's also a strength, is to see where my students can be. And I feel like I've mentored some students and guided some students in ways that have helped them to become successful. But I think, students have really positive feedback on my classes. I just won the staff. It was the Student-Centered Staff Award on our campus. And I get good feedback, and I think I'm even highly rated and rate my professor, which doesn't really mean a whole lot because usually it's just angry students or happy students who go there. But I liked it that they wrote some specific comments and said, you definitely have to go to class and you definitely have to do all the reading. So that I was proud of. I think I negotiate my weaknesses and my talents to teach.
One of the things that came up during my job interview process for Academic Post was the question, how do you connect as an autistic individual with students? Beyond the obviously offensive implication of the question, it still seems to need an answer. So how would you say you connect your way of thinking to students in conversation in a writing lab and tutoring environment?
Well, I think it helps me to understand the sensory difference and the sensory overload. And, sometimes if I see a student just kind of shutting down, I know that they're getting overwhelmed. I've had students with autism I worked with in the center who every other sentence they would say, "I'm sorry." And that makes it feel awkward, but I just would kind of let them know that if you ever do anything that really involves an "I'm sorry," I'll let you know. But otherwise, we can just have a blanket statement that I accept you just the way you are, and you don't have to apologize to me. But there's a lot of diversity in what I see and how I see students, and I really think that I have to adapt to where they are and try to find a way into successful communication with them, because you can't really generalize too much. I had a student who struggled. He was in an English class, and I was even collaborating. We even had a team of folks collaborating on campus. Everybody really likes the student. but he became really frustrated in a session one day, and he he would say shit, and then he would say I'm sorry, a couple of seconds later. But he finally was frustrated enough. He had a little meltdown in the center, and he was frustrated enough that we ended our session, and he went and he came back a couple of hours later and apologized to me. But I think just being understanding to the fact that there may be differences in communication, there may be differences in processing. I try to be aware of how a student is processing the language that I'm using and be willing to shift modes. I have a whiteboard so that I can write on that to communicate. I try to keep all the different channels open as far as how we communicate, but it's hard to generalize about how we do that.
And I think that that's an important point to raise, is that the myth that all autistics think in concrete pictures, or that we all think in mathematical terms, or that we all think in any particular way, because we are subjected to those assumptions, we tend to resist assumptions about ourselves and other people. But again, that's a generalization in itself. But I do find that because I'm subjected to so many assumptions about autism, that I try to resist assumptions about my students.
Sure. And unfortunately, people on campus are trying, but, we get the folks who have the pop culture definition. Oh, I watched The Good Doctor. I know about autism. Oh, I watched, what's the sciencey thing?
Big Bang Theory.
Big Bang Theory, yeah. So they think that they watched a couple episodes of Big Bang Theory, so now they understand autism. And they have just a couple of generalizations, like a couple of traits, and that if you don't show that, well, clearly you're not autistic, or the student is not autistic. Well, no, it's more complicated than that. But I mean, that's sort of a human defect, that we want everything oversimplified, and we want to know whose team everybody is on. That's always bothered me, the team thing. Why can't we be on the team of everybody, people who need it? Why do we have to have this one team that we're on, and we can be shoved off into this category? I don't think social media has helped there. I think it's made things even more binary.
One of the things that I'm interested in that you've discussed as an academic is social construction. Autism itself is a theoretical construct, a checklist. And so in some ways, your fascination with theory must influence how you theorize about the labels now applied to you.
I think that labels are helpful when they're helpful, and we also have to resist the urge to let labels dictate anything, or to override good sense. Like, we should have some common sense about things.
Because I read so much, and maybe too much, I don't know, I find myself ambivalent about the label, even the autistic me, which I've written about. I'd rather not have a label, but does this label help me? Does it give? So the theory of language and the theory of social construction starts to create something of a feedback loop in my self-analysis. Do you experience that?
I mean, we all construct ourselves in some ways. I think the most helpful insights for me have come from sensory processing areas and understanding my struggles sometimes, which largely I have just ignored. Like, my position has just been to plow through and ignore it. And the other day in the writing center, we were doing professional development after the term had ended, and we had opened the door, but the birds were so loud that it was distracting me, and actually, because of the pitch, I think, was hurting when the birds would tweet. So I had to go close the door. I didn't explain it at the time because we're in the middle of a conversation. But I think it's been helpful for me to cut myself a break on some of the sensory processing things, because being overwhelmed in your senses creates a situation where you can dam it up for a little while, but eventually it's going to break the dam or flow around it. And that's not ideal. So that makes the whole performance and disclosure aspect that much more difficult.
When you are approaching a field like writing studies, which is heavily theoretical, have you found that your passion for theory has helped with your scholarship and your teaching because the field itself is heavily theory-based?
I think I pick up on theory really fast, and that's a huge benefit to me. I hardly ever, I can't really recall encountering a theory at any point that I couldn't dig into and then maybe even find a use for. I think it's an advantage in some ways. In some ways, it's a disadvantage because I'll leap ahead before other people are really ready to. If we're having a discussion, I'm like 5 steps down the chessboard. And sometimes that makes it difficult for me to communicate with folks or to wait until they get where I am in what I want to discuss. So it's kind of a double-edged sword in some way.
One of the things that I have found is that I pick and choose sort of cafeteria style from the long list of theories available to writing and communication instruction and professors. And I find that I don't buy complete theories, but I buy aspects of them. And some of my colleagues want complete buy-in of a specific theorist or a specific set of theorists, as where I'm busy saying, well, I kind of like this thing over here about social engagement, and I sort of like this thing over here about language and natural processing. So I find myself sort of melding different theories to create something that I can live with. Do you find yourself doing the same, or do you find that you focus on a particular theorist or school of thought for a time?
The theories are just stuff that I play with. Theories are really just lenses into reality, which is kind of the same way I see religions, but that's probably problematic for a lot of people here. But I see them as lenses into the reality of a situation. So we adopt a particular lens to look at a particular situation or idea or what it is that we're wanting to teach. But we switch lenses all the time, and I see a lot of connections between theories. I think that's one of the, we talk about the neural pathways being different and the brain's kind of rewired itself in autism. Well, I think that maybe that's where I utilize that, is that I see the connections between theories. And I think I do a lot of sort of over theory work where I'm stepping back from the theories and seeing what's useful in each one and putting those connections together. Whereas others can only go one theory at a time. I'd rather take on 5.
I really appreciate you taking this time to discuss how you do theory as an instructor and as a student. I do think it's important that we break down the myths of autism being any one thing and autistic individuals thinking in particular ways. I think it's wonderful that there are opportunities for those of us who do like theory to engage in academic scholarship and research.
Thank you very much for the interview.
This has been The Autistic Me with Daniel Sansing. I'm Christopher Scott Wyatt, and I look forward to our next meeting.